This story you're about to hear is one of the most difficult, yet one of the most important in all of human history. It is not simply a history of leaders or battles. It is the story of how millions of ordinary people, through silence and complacency, allowed one of the darkest tragedies of our world to unfold. Over 15 chapters, we will gently walk through the atmosphere of Germany before and during the Holocaust, exploring how fear, obedience, propaganda, and everyday choices shaped a nation's descent into complicity. Hello, and welcome to History to Relax. My name is Brian, and I want to thank you for joining me on this reflective journey. Before we begin, I invite you to support the channel by pressing the like button, subscribing if you haven't already, and leaving a comment below to let me know where in the world you are listening from. It's always inspiring to see how far these stories travel, and your messages help us build a community of listeners who share a love for history told slowly, calmly, and with care. Now, take a deep breath. Find a comfortable place to rest. Let the outside world fade for a little while, because our story is about to begin. Part 1: A Nation in Ruins. Germany at the end of the First World War was a nation without balance, a land where the ground itself seemed to have shifted beneath people's feet. The war had lasted 4 long years, and in those years, millions of young men had marched away with a sense of duty and a belief in the strength of their empire. By 1918, the dream of victory had shattered. Soldiers stumbled home exhausted, scarred, and often broken in body or spirit. Families that had once written hopeful letters to the front were left instead with telegrams of death. The loss was not just military, it was personal, emotional, and collective. When the guns finally fell silent, Germany faced more than defeat. The Kaiser had fled into exile, and with him, the old imperial order dissolved. In its place rose the Weimar Republic, a democratic system that was fragile from its first breath. For many Germans, this change felt less like renewal and more like abandonment. The familiar structures of monarchy and military prestige were gone, replaced by uncertainty and quarrels among politicians who seemed unable to control the tides of disorder. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in 1919, sealed the sense of national humiliation. Its terms were harsh. Germany was forced to accept sole blame for the war, even though many citizens believed the conflict had been the result of a wider struggle of empires. Reparations were imposed at levels so high that the German economy staggered under the burden. Entire regions were stripped away, Alsace-Lorraine to France, land to the new state of Poland, colonies overseas divided among the victors. The Rhineland was to be demilitarized, leaving the country's western border exposed. The army was cut down to a fraction of its former size, its navy reduced, its pride dismantled piece by piece. The sense of betrayal that followed cannot be overstated. For the soldier who had survived the trenches, for the widow who had lost her husband, for the family struggling to put bread on the table, Versailles was not just a political treaty, it was a brand burned into the skin of the nation, a symbol of dishonor. Many Germans referred to it simply as the Diktat, the dictated peace imposed without justice. In the years that followed, life grew harder still. The Weimar Republic attempted to balance the heavy reparations payments with an economy already weakened by war. Inflation began to creep upward. By the early 1920s, it exploded into hyperinflation. The German mark collapsed so rapidly that wages lost value between the morning and the afternoon. A wheelbarrow of banknotes was needed to buy a loaf of bread. Housewives rushed to markets carrying stacks of paper money only to find prices had doubled again before they arrived. Children used worthless notes to build kites or paper toys. Savings carefully stored away for decades vanished overnight. What was left behind was a deep, gnawing sense that stability itself had abandoned the country. Images from those years tell the story with cruel clarity. In Berlin, photographs show men standing with bundles of banknotes taller than themselves, currency stacked like firewood. In smaller towns, bakers demanded payment in advance, afraid that by the time bread came out of the oven, the price would have doubled. Some workers were paid twice a day so they could rush to spend their wages before they evaporated into meaninglessness. Pensioners who had trusted the system to protect their future suddenly found themselves destitute. This economic nightmare was not endured in silence. Strikes broke out, political factions blamed one another, and violence spilled onto the streets. Paramilitary groups, many formed by disillusioned veterans, fought pitched battles against communists and social democrats. The fragile democracy seemed constantly on the edge of collapse. For ordinary families, these years meant not only hunger, but fear that tomorrow would bring new riots, new shortages, new humiliations.
By 1923, hyperinflation reached its peak. A loaf of bread in Berlin that had cost 250 marks at the start of the year cost 200 billion marks by November. To restore order, the government introduced a new currency, the Rentenmark, and for a time stability returned.
Foreign loans, particularly from the United States, helped rebuild industry. The Golden Twenties offered a brief window of calm. Jazz played in Berlin nightclubs, theaters thrived, and cultural experimentation flourished. To many outsiders, Germany seemed to be recovering, but beneath the surface, resentment remained. The wounds of Versailles had not healed. Many Germans held to the belief that their army had not truly been defeated on the battlefield, but had been betrayed from within. This stab in the back myth became a poisonous idea repeated in speeches, newspapers, and conversations at kitchen tables.
Jews, socialists, and communists were accused of weakening the nation, of selling out the soldiers who had fought bravely. The myth was false, but it offered a simple explanation for a complex disaster. It told people what they wanted to hear, that they were not defeated by stronger armies, but by traitors among their own.
When the Great Depression struck in 1929, all illusions of recovery shattered. The American loans that had supported German industry dried up. Factories closed. Banks collapsed. By 1932, nearly 6 million Germans were unemployed, about 1 in 3 of the workforce. Families who had survived the hardships of the early 1920s now faced another wave of hunger and despair. Long lines formed outside soup kitchens. Shoes were mended again and again until they fell apart. Children went to school with empty stomachs. This new crisis created fertile ground for extremism. Political parties promised salvation, but few could deliver. Street violence returned with renewed intensity. Paramilitary marches filled the cities. The communists promised revolution while the far right promised a rebirth of national pride. The Democratic Center, weak and divided, seemed powerless to act. For ordinary Germans, the feeling was once again of a world crumbling. The Republic offered no certainty. The politicians in Parliament seemed more interested in arguing than in saving the nation. People longed for stability, for order, for someone who could restore dignity to a country that had become, in their eyes, a laughingstock among nations. Into this space of despair stepped Adolf Hitler and the National Socialist German Workers' Party. At first, they were dismissed by many as extremists shouting at the margins, but Hitler's words carried a strange power. He spoke not as a cautious politician, but as a man utterly convinced of his vision. His speeches promised not only economic revival, but the restoration of pride. He told Germans that they had been wronged, that they were victims of a global conspiracy, and that together they could rise again. For those who had lost jobs, savings, or family honor, his certainty was magnetic. The Nazi Party also offered something that the fragile democracy could not: spectacle. The rallies were vast and meticulously organized, filled with banners, uniforms, and symbols that gave the impression of discipline and unity. Where the Republic looked weak, the Nazis looked strong. Where democracy argued, the Nazis marched in lockstep. For people exhausted by chaos, this order was comforting. It is important to understand that many Germans did not embrace Hitler because they agreed with every detail of his ideology. Some were indifferent to his obsession with race or his hatred of Jews. What they saw was a man who seemed capable of restoring stability, who offered a vision of national renewal. They wanted to believe that he could deliver them from ruins into greatness. By 1933, Hitler was appointed chancellor. Within months, the Reichstag fire and the Enabling Act gave him the power to rule without parliament. Political opponents were silenced, press freedoms curtailed, dissent crushed. And yet, for millions of Germans, life seemed to improve. Employment began to rise. Massive public works projects like the building of the Autobahn gave people hope. Military rearmament, though forbidden by Versailles, offered jobs and restored pride. After years of ruin, the sense of humiliation began to fade. This is the paradox at the heart of the story. The silence of millions of Germans during the rise of Nazism cannot be explained only by fear or hatred. It must also be understood as a response to years of despair. People longed for stability more than freedom, for pride more than justice. They accepted silence because it seemed to promise survival. By the early 1930s, the ruins of war, the scars of inflation, the wounds of depression, and the myths of betrayal had all converged to shape a nation ready to follow. It is here, in these ruins, that complacency began. Not in the camps, not in the ghettos, but in the hunger of children, in the emptiness of bank accounts, in the broken promises of democracy. The soil of silence had been prepared long before the seeds of dictatorship were sown. In the end, Germany in the 1920s and early 1930s was not a land of evil monsters, but of ordinary people living through extraordinary hardship. They did not ask what price would be paid for recovery. They asked only that someone promise them hope, order, and dignity. And when that promise came, clothed in the words and symbols of National Socialism, they were ready to listen. Part 2: The Allure of a Strong Hand. The years after the Great Depression left the German people not only poorer, but weary in their hearts. Hardship does not always break a nation's spirit in open revolt. More often, it seeps into daily life until people begin to crave something, anything, that will bring back a sense of order. In Germany during the late 1920s and early 1930s, that craving grew strong. The Weimar Republic, fragile from birth, was never truly trusted. To some, it was a forced child of defeat, born out of Versailles, tied to humiliation. To others, it was a stage of constant argument. Parties in parliament quarreled endlessly, governments fell with dizzying speed, and coalitions rose and collapsed almost before the ink of their agreements dried. The very symbol of democracy became entangled with instability. In times of prosperity, citizens may tolerate debate and compromise. In times of hunger, such patience withers. Germans had lived through years where currency turned worthless, through strikes and riots, through breadlines and unemployment. They saw neighbors dragged into fights between communists and nationalists on city streets. Parents sent their children to school with shoes patched again and again, not knowing if there would be food at the end of the day. In such moments, the appeal of strong leadership begins to grow. A steady hand, a clear voice, a promise to cut through chaos, these become not just political desires, but psychological needs. Adolf Hitler understood this longing. He did not rise to power only because of ideology. He rose because he offered the image of certainty in a world where certainty had vanished. His speeches were filled with anger, yes, but also with clarity. He told the people exactly who was to blame and exactly how Germany would rise again. In a time when most politicians hedged and compromised, Hitler's absolute confidence was like a flame in darkness. Crowds gathered to hear him not only for the words, but for the feeling. Photographs and films show faces rapt with attention, people leaning forward as if they had found someone who could finally make sense of their suffering. He spoke to the wounded pride of veterans, to the hunger of the unemployed, to the humiliation of those who remembered Versailles. His voice promised to sweep away weakness, to restore Germany's rightful place among nations. It is easy from a distance to wonder how so many could believe, but one must remember the context. These were not people looking at Hitler from the comfort of stability. They were people who had seen their parents' savings vanish, who had lived through hunger, who had lost faith in democracy. When he declared that Germany would stand tall again, that jobs would return, that the shame of Versailles would be undone, it was not ideology that carried the message, it was hope. The Nazi Party also presented itself with a discipline and order that contrasted sharply with the chaos of Weimar politics. Their rallies were carefully choreographed spectacles. Rows of uniformed men marched with precision, banners rippled in the wind, and torches lit the night sky. The swastika, stark and simple, became a symbol that seemed eternal, a sign of unity in place of division. For many Germans, watching these rallies was like witnessing a vision of strength they thought had been lost forever. It was not only the poor who felt the allure. Mid-class shopkeepers, teachers, and professionals also longed for a government that seemed decisive. Many of them feared communism as much as they feared poverty. In the 1930s, the Soviet Union stood as a shadow on Germany's eastern border, and stories of revolution, famine, and purges spread across Europe. To many Germans, the choice seems stark. Chaos and Bolshevik terror on one side, or order and revival under a strong leader on the other. The image of Hitler as a savior was also carefully crafted. Propaganda portrayed him not as a politician, but as a man of destiny. Posters showed him bathed in light, a messianic figure walking among his people. Speeches described him as the voice of the nation itself. By the time he became chancellor in 1933, he was not just a leader to his supporters, he was a symbol of rebirth. What is striking is how quickly ordinary people accepted the trade of freedom for stability. Civil liberties were curtailed almost immediately after Hitler took office. The Reichstag fire decree suspended freedom of the press, freedom of speech, and the right to assembly. The Enabling Act handed him dictatorial powers. Yet instead of resistance, there was relief. Newspapers that once debated policy were silenced, but many Germans welcomed the quiet. Political opponents were jailed, but for those weary of conflict, this seemed like the end of chaos. In workplaces, unemployment began to fall. The Nazis introduced massive public works programs, new highways, construction projects, military rearmament. For the first time in years, men who had stood idle found themselves employed. Families who had queued for bread could buy food again. Mothers watched their children eat with full stomachs. It mattered little to them that freedoms were being eroded. What mattered was that life felt stable once more. Psychologists later described this longing as the authoritarian personality, a tendency to seek strong leaders in times of fear, but to those living through it, it did not feel like surrender. It felt like rescue. They were not giving up liberty, they were receiving protection. The allure of a strong hand also worked because it appealed to identity. Hitler did not simply promise jobs or order, he promised pride. He told Germans that they were not weak, that they had been betrayed, that they belonged to a race destined for greatness. For people who had lived through years of humiliation, such words were intoxicating. They could believe, at last, that their suffering had not been meaningless, but was part of a larger story, a story of a people who would rise again. This chapter in history reveals an uncomfortable truth. People do not always seek freedom above all else. Often they seek belonging, dignity, and security. When those are absent, they may welcome the strong hand that promises to restore them, even if that hand closes into a fist. By the mid-1930s, Germany had transformed. The parliament still existed on paper, but real power rested with Hitler. Opposition had been crushed. Trade unions were dissolved. Independent newspapers silenced. Yet the streets seemed calm, the economy improved, and the symbols of pride returned. Swastikas hung from buildings, parades filled cities, children joined youth organizations. The nation that had once seemed broken now appeared united.
This was the allure, not the details of ideology, not even the threats against minorities, which many ignored, but the simple, overwhelming desire to feel secure under a leader who promised strength. The German people, exhausted by years of ruin, reached out for stability and found it in the figure of Adolf Hitler.
And so the silence deepened. Part 3: The Machinery of Persuasion.
The rise of Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party cannot be understood only through economics or politics. Material hardship and longing for stability prepared the ground, but what made the seeds grow was persuasion. The Nazi regime did not simply rely on force to secure obedience.
It built a machinery of propaganda so vast and so constant that it reshaped the way Germans saw the world, and often the way they understood themselves. This machinery worked not by presenting lies alone, but by creating an entire atmosphere of belief. It wrapped daily life in symbols, rituals, and stories that made Nazism appear natural, inevitable, and even noble. To walk the streets of Germany in the 1930s was to breathe in this atmosphere at every corner.
At the heart of this system stood Joseph Goebbels, the Minister of Propaganda. A small man with a sharp mind and a gift for words, Goebbels understood something fundamental. Propaganda was not only about information, it was about emotion. People did not simply need to be told what to think.
They needed to feel it, to live it, to experience it in such a way that alternatives faded from view. One of the most powerful tools was the spectacle of mass rallies. The Nazi Party perfected the art of political theater. Nuremberg, in particular, became a stage where the regime displayed its vision of unity and power. Tens of thousands marched in perfect order. Flags rippled in choreographed waves of red and black. Torches lit the night with a glow that seemed almost religious. Hitler would appear last, stepping into the light as if summoned by destiny itself. The speeches were delivered with rhythm, rising in intensity until the crowd shouted as one. For those who attended, these rallies were overwhelming. Individuals felt absorbed into a larger body. no longer isolated by hardship, but part of a nation united. For those watching newsreels in cinemas, the same affect carried across the screen. The message was clear: Germany was no longer divided or weak. It was strong, disciplined, and eternal. Symbols reinforced the message everywhere. When a symbol becomes this constant, it stops asking for belief. It simply demands acceptance. The Nazi regime also understood the power of new technologies. Radio became a centerpiece of persuasion. Goebbels oversaw the production of cheap receivers known as the People's Radio. These devices were deliberately limited in range, making it difficult for listeners to tune into foreign stations. Millions of households acquired them. In kitchens and living rooms across Germany, voices of the Führer and his ministers became part of daily life. Speeches, news bulletins, and patriotic songs echoed through apartments and farmhouses. The intimacy of radio meant that propaganda entered not just public squares, but private spaces. It whispered into homes, into families, into quiet evenings.
Cinema carried the message further. Leni Riefenstahl's films, such as Triumph of the Will, transformed rallies into myth. Her camera angles glorified Hitler, making him appear both human and more than human, a man and a symbol. Documentaries and newsreels repeated images of strength, while fictional films began to weave Nazi ideology into their plots.
Audiences were not only entertained, they were enveloped in a vision of a Germany purified and powerful.
Newspapers, too, were brought under control. Independent voices were silenced, editors replaced, critical journalists removed. What remained was a press that repeated the party line: Germany was rising, enemies surrounded it. Unity was essential, Jews and communists were threats. For many citizens, these newspapers became their only window to the world.
Over time, repetition gave weight to claims that might otherwise have seemed outrageous.
Education became another arm of persuasion. School books were rewritten to emphasize racial theory, glorify German history, and instill loyalty to Hitler. Teachers joined Nazi organizations and were expected to model obedience. Children learned songs of devotion, pledged oaths, and celebrated Hitler's birthday as if it were a national holiday.
Youth groups, especially the Hitler Youth, reinforced these lessons outside the classroom. Marches, camping trips, and drills turned young people into soldiers of ideology before they ever wore a uniform. The machinery of persuasion did not always rely on grand gestures. Sometimes it worked through small, everyday rituals. Citizens greeted one another with Heil Hitler, transforming even casual encounters into moments of loyalty. Portraits of Hitler hung in offices and schools. National holidays were remade into displays of Nazi strength. Bit by bit, life itself seemed to revolve around the new order. The genius and the danger of this system lay in its ability to blur the line between belief and habit. Not everyone who raised an arm in salute did so with passion. Many did so simply because it was expected. Yet over time, habit shapes thought. The act of saluting, repeated daily, created the impression of unanimity. To doubt became to feel alone, surrounded by a nation that appeared utterly convinced.
It is important to remember that persuasion did not always work by inspiring enthusiasm. Often, it worked by making alternatives invisible. Dissenting voices were not just punished, they were erased. Books were burned in great public bonfires, reducing centuries of thought to ash. Newspapers that once criticized were silenced. Political parties were banned.
When only one story is told, day after day, even skeptics begin to grow quiet.
The Nazi machinery of persuasion also understood the use of fear. Propaganda did not simply exalt the nation, it warned of enemies. Jews were portrayed in posters and films as corrupt, dangerous, and inhuman. Communists were depicted as violent conspirators. Foreign nations were shown as predators waiting to crush Germany.
By exaggerating threats, the regime made loyalty seem like survival. To doubt was not only disloyal, it was dangerous. Ordinary people, faced with this constant stream of images and words, found it difficult to resist. Some were swept up with genuine belief. Others complied out of habit or fear. Many convinced themselves that even if they did not agree with every claim, much of it must be true. After all, it was repeated everywhere, on the radio, in newspapers, in schools, on the streets.
The machinery of persuasion was not simply about politics. It was about identity. It told Germans that they were part of a chosen people, destined for greatness, betrayed in the past but now rising again. It offered them pride in place of humiliation, unity in place of division, purpose in place of despair. In such an atmosphere, silence was not only common,
it was expected. By the late 1930s, this machinery had woven itself so deeply into German life that to imagine an alternative felt impossible. Hitler's speeches were broadcast to cheering crowds, but they were also heard quietly in living rooms where families gathered around radios. Children recited slogans in classrooms. Workers marched in parades. Farmers listened to speeches in village halls. The message was not distant or occasional. It was constant, intimate, and relentless. And so, the people learned not only to obey, but to feel as though obedience was natural. The machinery of persuasion had done its work. A nation once fractured now appeared united. A people once weary now seemed inspired. A country once filled with doubts now shouted with one voice. This was not the whole truth, of course. Doubts remained. Not all were convinced. But in a world where propaganda filled every space, doubt grew quiet, hidden, cautious. Publicly, at least, Germany belonged to the image created by the machinery of persuasion, and in that silence, the path to greater horrors was cleared. Part 4. Enemies within. Every great act of persecution begins not with violence, but with stories that divide the world into us and them. In Germany during the 1930s, the Nazi regime perfected this division. It taught that Germany's rebirth could only come through the removal, the silencing, and eventually the destruction of those defined as enemies within.
This strategy did not appear overnight. It drew on older prejudices, reshaped them, and gave them new force through the machinery of propaganda. Anti-Jewish sentiment had deep roots in Europe, stretching back centuries. Jews had long been blamed for misfortunes, accused of controlling money, of spreading disease, of holding secret power. Such stereotypes, though false, had lingered like shadows in the European imagination. The Nazis did not invent these ideas. They exploited them, transforming old resentments into a central pillar of modern politics. After the First World War, conspiracy theories flourished. The stab in the back myth claimed that Germany had not been defeated militarily but had been betrayed by Jews, socialists, and communists at home. Though historians know this was false, it offered an explanation that was simple, emotional, and satisfying to those humiliated by defeat. Instead of confronting the complexity of war, people could blame a hidden hand. The Nazis seized this myth and gave it a new life. In speeches and posters, Hitler and his followers insisted that Germany's decline was not accidental. It was deliberate, caused by traitors living among the people. Jews were portrayed not merely as different but as dangerous parasites feeding on the nation's body.
Communists were depicted as agents of chaos, waiting to destroy order. Together, these groups were cast as enemies within, foes more insidious because they lived next door. This framing served a powerful psychological purpose. When a society suffers, anger looks for a target. Blaming external enemies, other nations, foreign armies, can only go so far. But blaming internal enemies gives people a sense of control. If traitors within are removed, life might improve. If parasites are purged, the nation might heal. By focusing resentment inward, the Nazis turned despair into hostility against neighbors, co-workers, and classmates. From the earliest days of Nazi rule, these enemies were singled out through law. In 1933, the regime introduced the first measures excluding Jews from civil service, universities, and cultural life. Teachers, judges, and doctors of Jewish descent were dismissed from their positions. Book burnings targeted Jewish authors. These acts were presented not as cruelty but as cleansing, the removal of harmful elements for the good of the whole. Many Germans accepted them, some with approval, others with indifference. Few resisted.
The regime also targeted communists and socialists. After the Reichstag fire in February 1933, the Nazis declared a state of emergency. Thousands of political opponents were arrested. The Communist Party was banned, its members beaten or imprisoned. Trade unions were dissolved and replaced by Nazi organizations.
Within months, the vibrant but divided political life of Weimar Germany had been crushed. Opponents disappeared into new concentration camps, the first of which was Dachau. Yet most ordinary citizens saw this not as injustice, but as order restored. The streets grew quieter, the arguments stopped. The labeling of enemies went hand in hand with propaganda. Newspapers like Der Stürmer, edited by Julius Streicher, published grotesque caricatures of Jews, portraying them as greedy, corrupt, and predatory. These images were crude, yet they worked. Over time, constant repetition wore down sympathy.
Children grew up seeing such images in schoolbooks, learning to associate neighbors with monstrosity. Posters warned of Jewish plots, films portrayed Jews as villains. Bit by bit, the line between truth and slander blurred. The Nazis also tied their racial ideology to science, presenting prejudice as fact. They claimed that Germans belonged to a master race, destined for greatness, while Jews and others were inherently inferior. Pseudo-scientific charts and measurements entered classrooms and clinics. Doctors lectured on racial hygiene, teachers instructed pupils to identify Jewish features.
What had once been a matter of opinion became, in the Nazi system, a matter of biology, and because it was framed as science, many accepted it without question. Ordinary life adjusted to these ideas. In 1935, the Nuremberg laws formalized the exclusion of Jews from German society. These laws stripped Jews of citizenship, forbade marriage or sexual relations between Jews and Aryans, and codified discrimination in nearly every aspect of public life. Jews could no longer vote, hold government jobs, or practice many professions. They were reduced to second-class status in their own homeland. For many Germans, these laws were not experienced as acts of violence. They were experienced as regulations, as rules that simply altered the boundaries of daily life. A neighbor lost his teaching position, a doctor closed his practice, a shop changed ownership. Life continued, but with fewer familiar faces. Because these changes came step by step, many did not recognize them as part of a larger descent. The silence deepened, not out of malice alone, but out of habit, convenience, and the willingness to look away. It was not only Jews who were targeted. Roma and Sinti communities, often labeled as gypsies, were harassed, forced into camps, and sterilized. People with disabilities were subjected to programs of forced euthanasia, framed as mercy but carried out with cruelty. Homosexuals were arrested and sent to concentration camps, identified by pink triangles sewn onto their uniforms. Each group was marked as an enemy within, blamed for weakening the nation. By spreading suspicion across many groups, the regime created a society where fear thrived. People watched what they said, careful not to appear sympathetic to the wrong neighbor. Denunciations became common, sometimes out of ideology, sometimes out of personal spite. To accuse someone of communist leanings or Jewish sympathies could remove a rival or curry favor with authorities. The culture of suspicion ensured silence, for to protest was to risk being labeled an enemy oneself. The Nazi vision of enemies within also extended to culture. Modern art was condemned as degenerate. Music by Jewish composers banned intellectuals who questioned ideology forced into exile. The regime promised a purified national culture, free from foreign or corrupting influences. This too played into the longing for unity. By removing enemies, Germany was told it could become whole again.
For ordinary Germans, the effect was subtle but profound. They were offered a bargain, accept the exclusion of certain groups, and in return, enjoy stability, pride, and belonging. Many accepted, not always out of hatred, but out of a desire to be part of the community that was promised. Silence became easier than protest, compliance easier than resistance.
And step by step, the circle of exclusion tightened until it prepared the way for violence.
By the late 1930s, Jews had been stripped of rights, isolated socially, and increasingly marked by visible signs of difference. Businesses owned by Jews were boycotted or seized. Identity cards bore the letter J. Passports were stamped. Women named Sarah. Men named Israel.
In November 1938, the violence burst into open view with Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass, when synagogues were burned, shops smashed, and thousands arrested. The public saw the destruction, heard the glass shatter, watched the flames, and yet the silence remained. Many looked away, telling themselves that this was not their concern, or even convincing themselves that the Jews must have done something to deserve it. The creation of enemies within was one of the most effective tools of the Nazi regime. It gave ordinary Germans a simple story in which to live. Their hardships were not random, but caused by traitors. Their future was not uncertain, but guaranteed if only the enemies were removed. To resist this story required courage, clarity, and risk. For most, it was easier to nod, to remain quiet, to accept. Thus, the machinery of persuasion and the allure of a strong hand were joined by something darker, the careful construction of enemies within. And once these enemies were defined, silenced, and excluded, the step from indifference to complicity became smaller. The silence of the many prepared the way for the suffering of the few. Part 5. The Rewards of Conformity. When we think of complicity, we often imagine it in terms of fear, people staying quiet because they dreaded punishment. Fear was indeed real in Nazi Germany, but it was not the only force at work. Silence was also bought. For many ordinary Germans, the persecution of Jews and other enemies of the state brought opportunities. To conform was not simply to avoid danger, it was to gain rewards. The process of dispossession began slowly with laws that excluded Jews from public life. By the mid-1930s, Jews had been pushed out of civil service jobs, universities, medicine, and law. This created vacancies. Every dismissal was an opening for someone else. Teachers once struggling to find employment suddenly found posts available. Young doctors could take over practices abandoned under duress. Lawyers built new careers on the ruins of Jewish competitors. For those who benefited, the system seemed less like oppression and more like fortune. Shops and businesses were also affected. The campaign of Aryanization transferred ownership of Jewish businesses into German hands. Often this meant that Jewish owners were forced to sell at prices far below value under pressure from new laws, boycotts, and harassment. A shopkeeper might wait to find that his Jewish competitor was closed, his window smashed, his license revoked. The market was suddenly clear for him to expand. Large companies, too, acquired factories and firms once run by Jews. In towns across Germany, prosperity for some was built directly on the persecution of others.
Housing provided another reward. As Jews were driven from neighborhoods, their apartments and homes became available. Families moved into larger flats or acquired property once belonging to those forced to leave. In cities like Berlin, Jews were crowded into smaller quarters, while their former homes were rented or purchased cheaply by non-Jewish Germans.
Each eviction was a tragedy for one family but a gain for another.
These benefits were not limited to property or jobs.
The Nazis also distributed small favors to those who conformed. Party membership could lead to better opportunities, promotions, or simply protection. Children of loyal party members found places in universities or youth programs. Communities that displayed enthusiasm for Nazi policies were rewarded with public works, parades, and attention from leaders. Loyalty paid in visible and tangible ways. The rewards of conformity were not always material. There was also the reward of belonging. In a society where public enthusiasm for Hitler was expected, joining in offered safety and pride. To raise one's arm and salute, to hang a swastika flag on the house, to participate in parades, these acts marked a person as part of the community. Conformity gave the comfort of inclusion, the sense of being on the winning side of history. Kristallnacht in November 1938 revealed how far these rewards could go. As synagogues burned and shops were destroyed, looters took what they wished. Some carried furniture, clothes, and valuables from Jewish homes. Others acquired goods at auctions held afterward, where Jewish property was sold off cheaply. The state organized the destruction, but many individuals profited directly. For them, silence was not only easier, it was profitable. The regime also offered Germans the chance to feel morally justified while gaining these rewards. Propaganda framed Aryanization not as theft, but as cleansing. By taking over Jewish businesses, people were told they were strengthening the nation. By moving into Jewish homes, they were part of a grand project of renewal. Theft was disguised as duty. Envy was disguised as patriotism. Of course, not all Germans profited directly. Many simply lived their lives, neither seizing property nor denouncing neighbors. But even for them, conformity had rewards. Stability returned, jobs increased, national pride swelled. Compared to the chaos of Weimar and the despair of the Depression, the 1930s under Nazi rule felt, for many, like a time of improvement. Families had food, children had activities, towns had parades. These small comforts dulled the urge to question where the improvements came from. The silence of the majority was thus reinforced by comfort. If life was better, why disturb it by speaking of injustice? If neighbors disappeared, why risk everything by asking why? To protest was to lose not only safety but also the rewards of belonging. To conform was to prosper. Even soldiers and officials found their own rewards in complicity. The looting of occupied territories, the seizure of art, gold, and valuables enriched many. German families received packages of goods taken from the East: clothes, furniture, jewelry. Soldiers wrote home about watches and coats taken from the dead. These rewards created a web of complicity stretching far beyond the Nazi leadership. Ordinary men and women were drawn into a system where silence brought comfort and cruelty brought gain. The rewards of conformity were also psychological. To join the majority, to chant in unison, to see oneself reflected in the cheering crowd, these experiences gave meaning in times of uncertainty. Germans were told they were building not just a nation, but a destiny. To conform was to feel significant, to be part of something larger than oneself. Few wanted to risk losing that sense of purpose by questioning the system that provided it. It is here that the quiet tragedy of complicity becomes most clear. Most Germans did not need to be forced at gunpoint into silence. They did not need constant threats. They were drawn into complicity by rewards both large and small: a job, a house, a full table, a sense of pride. Once comfort was tied to silence, breaking that silence became unthinkable. By the outbreak of war in 1939, the system was firmly in place. Jews had been excluded from most of public life, their property seized, their freedoms curtailed. Millions of Germans, meanwhile, had found opportunity, stability, and pride in the new order. The rewards of conformity had done their work. A society once fractured now seemed united, not only through fear, but through gain. This is one of the darker lessons of history. Oppression does not survive on violence alone. It survives because many find it profitable, or at least convenient, to let it continue. Silence is not always born of terror. Sometimes it is born of comfort. And in 1930s Germany, comfort was often built on the ruins of Jewish lives. Part 6: Fear in the Air. Fear in Nazi Germany was not always loud. It was often quiet, like a presence in the room, a weight in the air. People carried it with them in the way they lowered their voices, in the way conversations stopped when a stranger entered, in the way eyes glanced at doorways before certain words were spoken. This was not the fear of open battle, but the subtler fear of living in a society where one never knew who might be listening, who might report, who might turn silence into survival and speech into danger. The Gestapo, the secret state police, embodied this fear. It was not a large organization in numbers. Historians estimate that in the mid-1930s it had only about 7,000 officers for the whole of Germany. But its power did not lie in its size. It lay in its reputation. The Gestapo cultivated an aura of omnipresence. Germans came to believe that its ears were everywhere, that no word could be spoken without risk of being overheard. This belief was often exaggerated, but it was effective. Fear spreads faster than fact. Denunciations by ordinary citizens made this system possible. The regime encouraged people to report suspicious behavior, unpatriotic remarks, or signs of disloyalty. A neighbor who complained too openly about shortages, a teacher who hesitated to use the Nazi salute, a shopkeeper who failed to display a swastika flag. Any of these could be denounced. Sometimes the motivation was ideological, but often it was personal. Old grudges, jealousies, or rivalries were settled by a whispered report to authorities. A careless joke could lead to arrest. A private complaint could end in interrogation. The knowledge of this possibility was enough to create silence. People learned to censor themselves, not only in public but in private. At family tables, fathers warned their children not to repeat things outside the home. In factories, workers nodded along to official speeches even if they doubted them in their hearts. In classrooms, students parroted slogans even when they did not fully believe. Fear worked not by punishing everyone, but by punishing enough to remind all of the cost. The Gestapo's methods deepened this sense of uncertainty. Arrests were sudden, often in the night. A knock at the door, boots on the stairs, a disappearance into custody. Families might not hear from loved ones for weeks, months, or ever again. Rumors spread of torture, of endless questioning, of prison camps where people vanished. Whether or not every story was true did not matter. What mattered was the affect. People grew wary of even the thought of resistance.
The concentration camp system reinforced this atmosphere. Dachau, opened in 1933, was not initially the death camp it would later inspire, but a place of punishment for political prisoners, communists, socialists, and others seen as enemies. The knowledge that camps existed, that people could be sent away for dissent, cast a long shadow over German society.
Ordinary citizens did not need to see the camps to know that silence was safer than defiance. Social pressure added another layer of fear. In small towns, conformity was visible. Everyone knew who hung a swastika flag and who did not. Everyone knew which children wore Hitler Youth uniforms and which did not. To refuse participation was to mark oneself as different, suspect, possibly disloyal. Fear of social exclusion often weighed as heavily as fear of the state. Humans crave belonging, and in a system where belonging was tied to conformity, silence became a form of self-protection. Even religious institutions felt this pressure. Pastors who criticized Nazi policies risked arrest. Some, like Martin Niemöller, were imprisoned for years. Others chose silence or carefully framed their sermons to avoid confrontation. Congregations learned to tread carefully, to speak in generalities rather than risk open defiance. The fear of losing one's pulpit or worse silenced many voices that might have resisted. Fear also worked through children. The Hitler Youth and the League of German Girls taught loyalty to the Führer and encouraged vigilance. Children were told to listen for disloyal words at home, to report even their parents if they heard complaints. Many did. The possibility that one's own child might betray a careless remark tightened the grip of silence. In such a world, trust itself was eroded.
It is important to recognize that fear was not constant terror for everyone. Life for many Germans in the 1930s and early 1940s could appear normal. They went to work, visited friends, celebrated birthdays. But beneath the surface of daily routines was the awareness that lines could not be crossed, questions could not be asked, criticisms could not be spoken aloud.
Fear lived in the pauses, in the things unsaid, in the careful choices of words. The combination of rewards and fear created a powerful trap. As described in the previous chapter, many benefited from conformity. Fear made sure they stayed quiet about how those benefits were achieved. Even those who felt unease about the treatment of Jews or political opponents often convinced themselves to remain silent. Why risk everything, a job, a home, one's family, for a neighbor already marked as an enemy? By the late 1930s, silence had become second nature. People no longer needed to be told not to speak. They censored themselves before the thought left their lips. They avoided dangerous topics, looked away from troubling sights, and nodded when expected. This is how fear works most effectively, not by constant violence, but by teaching people to discipline themselves. And yet, fear did not extinguish all courage. Some spoke out, resisted, sheltered neighbors, distributed leaflets, but they were few, and they paid dearly. The majority chose silence. In the balance of comfort and risk, of belonging and punishment, the weight of fear tipped the scale. By the time the war began in 1939, Germany was a society enveloped in quiet fear. The Gestapo did not need to be everywhere because the possibility that it might be was enough. Denunciations, arrests, and disappearances reinforced the lesson, and so conversations grew cautious, thoughts remained unspoken, and silence deepened. In this silence, atrocities could unfold. Fear kept people from asking questions, from protesting, from breaking the conformity that held them together. The air itself seemed to whisper, "Be careful, be quiet, do not draw attention." Fear in the air, unseen, unheard, but ever present, ensured that silence remained the safest path. And in that silence, complicity took root. Part 7. The Slow Boil. When we look back at the Holocaust, it is tempting to see it as a sudden descent into horror, as if a line was crossed overnight, as if a single order transformed a society into accomplices. At first, the change is barely felt, then it grows warmer, and only when it is too late do people realize that the world around them has transformed beyond recognition. In Nazi Germany, this slow boil began the moment Hitler rose to power in 1933. The earliest measures against Jews and other so-called enemies of the state were subtle compared to what would come later. They began as boycotts, dismissals, and restrictions. A Jewish doctor could no longer treat patients covered by state insurance. A Jewish lawyer could no longer represent clients in court. A Jewish teacher found himself dismissed from his post. Each step was justified as temporary, as reasonable, as part of the restoration of Germany. Few saw these measures for what they were, the opening moves of exclusion. For many ordinary Germans, these early acts did not feel like persecution in their own lives. They felt like regulations applied to others. If your family was not Jewish, the closing of Jewish shops might mean only that you shopped elsewhere. If your child was not taught by a Jewish teacher, his dismissal seemed irrelevant. The suffering was real, but it was not universal. And because it was not universal, it was easier for the majority to ignore. The Nazis understood this psychology. They moved step by step, careful not to provoke too much resistance at once. Each law prepared the way for the next. Each restriction made the following one seem less shocking. When Jewish doctors were first excluded from the public health system, it seemed harsh but limited. Later, when they were barred from practicing altogether, the ground had already been prepared. The 1935 Nuremberg laws marked a significant turning point. With them, Jews were stripped of citizenship, forbidden to marry or even have intimate relationships with Aryans. These laws were not presented as cruelty, but as protection. Protection of German blood, German honor, German destiny. At Nazi rallies, they were announced with fanfare, as if they were triumphs of national renewal rather than acts of exclusion. For many Germans, the logic was easy to swallow. They had been told for years that Jews were corrupting the nation. If that were true, then keeping them separate seemed not only reasonable, but necessary. Daily life changed gradually. Jewish businesses were boycotted, then seized. Jewish children were moved into separate schools, then expelled entirely. Jews were barred from public parks, swimming pools, libraries, and theaters. Each exclusion tightened the circle, shrinking the space where Jewish life could exist. For neighbors, these changes were visible but incremental. A family down the street moved away, a shop closed, a synagogue stood empty. Life adjusted, and what once might have caused outrage became routine.
The slow boil worked in another way as well. It blurred responsibility. No single law, no single event, seemed to demand outrage. Each act, taken alone, appeared small, even bureaucratic. Who would risk their livelihood to protest a rule about marriage licenses, or about which doctors could practice, or which shops could stay open?
But together, these acts formed a web that suffocated Jewish life in Germany. The cruelty lay not only in the content of each law but in the accumulation of them, step after step. Kristallnacht in November 1938 revealed how far the temperature had risen. For 2 nights, synagogues burned, shops were smashed, and Jews were beaten in the streets while police looked away. The sound of shattering glass echoed through cities and towns. For many Germans, this was the first time persecution became impossible to ignore. Flames lit the night sky, and the violence was visible to all. Yet even then, silence held. Some were horrified, others indifferent, still others quietly pleased to see enemies humiliated. Most did nothing. The slow boil had done its work. Years of smaller exclusions had dulled outrage, making open violence easier to accept. After Kristallnacht, the pace of exclusion accelerated. Jews were required to carry identification cards stamped with a J. Their passports were marked, their names changed, men forced to adopt Israel, women Sarah. They were barred from most professions, banned from attending universities, restricted in travel.
Radios, typewriters, and telephones were confiscated. Step by step, they were isolated not only from public life but from the ability to communicate, to work, to move.
By the time deportations began in the early 1940s, many Germans were accustomed to absence. The slow boil had trained them not to notice. Jewish neighbors had been pushed out of jobs, schools, and businesses long before they were pushed onto trains. By the time trains carried them eastward, silence felt natural. The extraordinary had been disguised as ordinary. The psychology of this gradual process is central to understanding complicity. Few Germans woke one morning eager to see neighbors destroyed. Most adjusted to each new measure because it did not feel decisive. It felt like a regulation, an inconvenience, a rule that applied to someone else. The human mind adapts quickly. What is shocking today becomes normal tomorrow, forgotten the day after. The Nazis understood this well, and they built their policies to exploit it.
It is often said that evil triumphs not through sudden force but through gradual erosion. In Germany, that erosion was marked by new laws, new signs, new restrictions, each small enough to pass with little resistance, each preparing the way for the next. The slow boil ensured that by the time the full heat of persecution arrived, many Germans no longer felt its burn.
This is the danger of silence in the face of small injustices. Each silence makes the next easier until silence itself becomes habit. And by the late 1930s, silence in Germany was no longer a choice for most. It was the norm. The slow boil had done its work. Part 8. The Bystander's Choice. In every society where injustice grows, there comes a moment when people see it plainly. They may not know every detail, but they witness enough to recognize that something is wrong. At that moment, silence becomes a choice. In Nazi Germany, millions faced this choice and turned away. The decision to remain bystanders, to look past the suffering of neighbors, colleagues, and fellow citizens, was one of the most powerful forces that allowed the Holocaust to unfold. The bystander's choice was rarely simple cowardice. It was woven from threads of fear, habit, selfishness, and rationalization. People told themselves that what was happening was temporary or exaggerated or beyond their power to change. They told themselves that their responsibility was only to family, to work, to survival. The cost of speaking out seemed high, the cost of silence invisible.
To understand this psychology, one must first imagine daily life in the Third Reich. For most Germans, especially those not directly targeted by the regime, life in the 1930s and early 1940s was marked by stability after years of turmoil. Jobs had returned, pride had been restored, order seemed secure.
Against this background, the suffering of Jews and other persecuted groups was easy to frame as an exception, as the misfortune of others. To focus on one's own well-being and avert one's eyes was tempting, and many did just that. The bystander's choice was reinforced by distance. Though exclusion was visible, empty shops, missing classmates, abandoned homes, the worst abuses often happened away from the center of public life. Concentration camps were built outside cities on the edges of awareness. Deportations often happened at night or in smaller groups without spectacle. A neighbor might vanish, a colleague might stop appearing at work, but without open explanation. In this way, persecution became a shadow in the background of ordinary life. People could tell themselves they did not know or that they knew less than they really did. Yet evidence was everywhere for those willing to see. Smoke from burning synagogues after Kristallnacht, the sounds of glass shattering, signs marking benches, shops, and neighborhoods for Jews only or for Aryans only, rumors of camps, whispered stories of violence, letters from soldiers describing mass shootings in the East. The truth was not completely hidden. What was hidden was the willingness to confront it. Psychologists describe this as moral disengagement. To protect themselves from the discomfort of witnessing injustice, people distance their thoughts. They tell themselves that victims must have done something wrong, that the authorities must know best, that the problem is exaggerated, that nothing can be done anyway. Each rationalization makes silence easier. Each silence makes complicity deeper. The Nazis encouraged this disengagement by portraying Jews not as neighbors but as outsiders, even threats. When people are told again and again that those who suffer are not truly part of the community, compassion withers. To remain silent about their fate becomes easier than if one saw them as equal. By redefining who counted as German, the regime gave bystanders a justification for looking away. There were moments when silence was broken. A few brave individuals spoke out, sheltered Jews, distributed leaflets, or protested. But they were exceptions. The majority chose the safety of silence. The bystander's choice was not necessarily one of hatred. Often it was one of resignation. Many felt powerless to change the course of events. Some feared the Gestapo, denunciations, or the loss of their livelihood. Others simply wished to avoid discomfort, to continue their lives without confronting the suffering around them. One of the most revealing aspects of bystander behavior is how ordinary it looked. Families sat at dinner tables, children played in the streets, markets bustled, all while neighbors were being pushed out of homes, stripped of rights, deported. Life went on, and in the continuation of ordinary life lay a quiet betrayal. Silence was not loud, but it was devastating. The bystander's choice was also reinforced by hope that things would not go further. People told themselves that persecution would stop at exclusion, that violence was temporary, that deportations meant resettlement rather than death. Believing such stories allowed them to maintain silence without feeling complicit. They could claim ignorance even when the signs were all around them. Looking back, it is tempting to condemn the bystanders harshly, and yet part of the lesson lies in recognizing how easily people slide into silence when confronted with injustice. Few saw themselves as participants in atrocity. They saw themselves as ordinary citizens trying to live their lives. But by choosing silence, they allowed the machinery of persecution to continue without resistance. By the early 1940s, the bystander's choice had become ingrained. Deportations began openly, yet protests were rare. Jews were forced to wear the yellow Star of David, making their exclusion visible in every street. Still, most Germans did not intervene. Trains left stations carrying neighbors away, and platforms filled with people who watched without words. In the silence of the bystanders, the regime found its greatest ally. This is perhaps the hardest truth of all. The Holocaust was not carried out in secret, hidden from the eyes of the people. It was carried out in the open, step by step, with millions choosing to look away. Their silence was not neutral. It was a choice that gave space for violence to grow. The bystander's choice reminds us that complicity does not always look like agreement or support. Sometimes it looks like quiet, like looking away, like continuing with one's own life while others suffer. In Nazi Germany, that quiet choice was made again and again until silence became the soundtrack to destruction. And so the story of complacency is not only about leaders, laws, or fear. It is also about the millions of small choices made by ordinary people, choices to remain silent, to avoid seeing, to turn away. In the end, those choices created the atmosphere in which atrocity could unfold. Part 9: What was known. One of the most enduring questions about the Holocaust is how much ordinary Germans truly knew. After the war, countless people claimed ignorance. They said they had no idea what was happening behind the barbed wire, in the ghettos, in the forests of the East. They insisted they only learned the truth when Allied soldiers opened the camps and forced the world to see. And yet, history tells a more complicated story. Complete ignorance was impossible. The signs were there, in the streets, in the letters from soldiers, in the smoke that drifted over towns, in the empty homes of vanished neighbors. What Germans knew was often less about details than about direction. They may not have known the scale of the final solution, but they knew enough to recognize that persecution was escalating into something more terrible. The challenge was not whether they knew, but what they chose to do with that knowledge. From the beginning, Nazi policies were carried out in plain sight. The boycotts of Jewish shops, the dismissal of Jewish professionals, the Nuremberg laws, the forced wearing of yellow stars, all of these happened in public. Neighbors saw neighbors humiliated, arrested, evicted. To claim ignorance of these events was impossible. The persecution of Jews was not hidden. It was advertised, displayed, and celebrated in rallies and newspapers. By the late 1930s, violence had become visible. Kristallnacht left shattered glass across city streets. Synagogues burned in full view of local populations. Jewish men were rounded up and sent to camps. These were not whispers or rumors. They were events witnessed by millions. At the very least, Germans knew that Jews were being targeted, excluded, and brutalized. When the war began in 1939, new layers of secrecy were added, but secrecy was never complete. Deportations began quietly, yet they were witnessed. Jews were marched through city streets to trains. Families disappeared overnight. Neighbors saw furniture left behind, shops closed, apartments emptied. The official language spoke of resettlement in the East, of labor camps, of opportunities elsewhere. But many did not believe these euphemisms. Soldiers wrote letters home describing mass shootings of Jews in Poland, in Ukraine, in the Baltic states. Villagers near execution sites heard the gunfire, saw the pits, smelled the aftermath. Trains carrying deportees rumbled through stations where bystanders watched the packed cars, the faces at the slats. By 1942, with the WWII conference formalizing the final solution, Killing centers like Auschwitz, Treblinka, and Sobibor became the heart of genocide. Official secrecy cloaked them, but the secrecy was thin. Smoke and ash from crematoria drifted into surrounding towns. Local populations knew what happened inside the barbed wire.
Civilians employed at nearby factories worked alongside prisoners. German companies profited from forced labor. The knowledge of mass death could not be erased from the senses of those nearby. Within Germany itself, rumors circulated constantly. People spoke of Jews being shot in forests, of ghettos emptied, of gas vans. Many dismissed these stories, or claimed not to believe them, but disbelief often masked a deeper truth. People chose not to press too hard. To believe too fully meant facing a responsibility they did not want.
To doubt, to shrug, to claim uncertainty, this was easier. Historians describe this as willful ignorance. Germans did not always know every detail, but they knew enough to ask questions, and they chose not to ask. They accepted the euphemisms, the rumors, the half-truths, because the alternative, confronting the reality of mass murder, was unbearable. Silence was not only enforced by fear, it was also maintained by denial, by the human tendency to avoid what is too painful or too dangerous to acknowledge.
There were other sources of knowledge as well. Soldiers returning on leave brought stories of mass shootings and deportations. Railway workers knew where the trains were going and what they carried. Businessmen involved in contracts for the SS knew that their laborers were prisoners from camps. Doctors and nurses working in institutions knew of sterilizations and euthanasia programs. The evidence was scattered, but it was abundant. And yet, many Germans insisted after the war that they had known nothing. Some truly may not have grasped the full machinery of genocide. Others may have convinced themselves that deportations meant labor rather than death. But the absence of complete knowledge does not erase the presence of partial knowledge. Germans knew enough to sense that terrible crimes were being committed. They knew enough to understand that silence protected them from dangerous truths. The question then becomes not what did they know, but why did they look away? Part of the answer lies in fear. To speak of atrocities risked denunciation, arrest, or worse. Part of it lies in selfishness. Life was better not asking questions. And part of it lies in the slow adaptation to cruelty. When a society has grown accustomed to smaller exclusions, it becomes easier to ignore larger ones. One cannot forget the role of propaganda here. The regime insisted that Jews were enemies, parasites, conspirators. If Jews disappeared, many Germans told themselves it was necessary, even deserved. To believe otherwise would mean questioning not only the state, but the moral order of the society they lived in. For many, it was easier to align with the official story, however implausible, than to admit the horror unfolding before them. There is a painful irony here. The Nazis did not hide the Holocaust in the way one might imagine. They hid it in plain sight, behind words, behind distance, behind the silence of neighbors. Ordinary Germans were not asked to kill. They were asked not to see too clearly, and most complied. When Allied armies entered the camps in 1945, they forced local populations to witness the bodies, the barracks, the ashes. Many Germans wept, some fainted, others claimed shock. But the truth is that the outlines of this horror had been visible all along. What was revealed in those camps was not something entirely unknown. It was the reality behind whispers, behind smoke, behind the empty spaces in towns and cities. It was the truth that many had suspected and chosen not to confront.
The lesson is not only historical but human. People often choose ignorance when knowledge demands too much of them. In Nazi Germany, millions chose silence and denial even when evidence was within reach. What Germans knew was enough to disturb, but not enough to compel action because they did not allow it to. Knowledge without acknowledgement became the greatest silence of all. And in that silence, the Holocaust unfolded. Part 10: The War as Cover. When war came in September 1939, it did more than redraw borders. It reshaped perception. In times of peace, the persecution of Jews had been visible, carried out in the streets, in shops, in neighborhoods. But once Europe was aflame with conflict, the violence of everyday life became harder to distinguish from the violence of the front. The suffering of Jews and other minorities was folded into the larger narrative of war, and in that narrative, atrocity could be hidden in plain sight. For ordinary Germans, the war created a new rhythm of attention. News was dominated by battles, victories, rationing, and the fate of soldiers at the front. Families worried about letters from sons and husbands, about air raids, about shortages of food and fuel. The hardships of war absorbed their focus. Even those who noticed deportations or heard whispers of killings often shifted their concern back to the more immediate anxieties of daily survival. War narrowed vision, shrinking the horizon of moral responsibility. The Nazi regime understood this dynamic and exploited it. From the very beginning, the war served as both justification and camouflage. Leaders claimed that harsh measures were necessary because Germany was at war, surrounded by enemies, threatened by spies and traitors. Violence could always be explained as wartime necessity.
Deportations were presented as resettlement for labor. Camps were described as tools for security. Mass shootings were framed as responses to partisan resistance. The war gave the regime a language that disguised genocide as strategy. Censorship tightened further as the war progressed. Radio, newspapers, and films focused on victories, sacrifices, and patriotism. Failures and atrocities were concealed. Photographs of jubilant soldiers filled papers, while defeats were hidden or softened with euphemisms. Germans lived in a media world where the war seemed glorious, even inevitable, and where crimes against Jews were rarely mentioned at all. The absence of information became its own kind of cover, allowing silence to deepen. The geography of war also helped conceal the Holocaust. The worst atrocities took place not in Berlin or Munich, but in the East, in Poland, Ukraine, Belarus, and beyond. Ghettos walled off Jewish populations, mass shootings filled pits and forests, extermination camps rose in remote areas. For most Germans, these places were distant, abstract, known only through rumor or the letters of soldiers. The physical distance allowed psychological distance. What happened out there seemed less immediate than the air raids over Hamburg or the rationing at home. And yet, fragments of knowledge flowed back. Soldiers wrote of mass executions, of villages emptied, of Jews herded into ghettos. Some letters were censored, but many reached families. Railway workers knew what was carried in sealed trains. Civilians in occupied territories saw the ghettos, the shootings, the smoke. Rumors circulated, but always against the background of war, a background that made them easier to dismiss. When the whole world seemed to be burning, one more atrocity could be absorbed into the noise. The war also gave Germans personal incentives not to question. Victories in Poland, France, and early in the Soviet Union brought pride, spoils, and a sense of destiny fulfilled.
Many Germans enjoyed goods taken from occupied lands, food, clothing, even furniture shipped home. Soldiers sent packages to families filled with belongings stolen from conquered populations. These comforts distracted from the source of the suffering. To question too deeply was to risk losing the benefits of conquest. As the war dragged on, hardships grew. Rationing intensified, air raids destroyed cities, and fear of defeat spread. In such conditions, survival became the priority. Few wanted to risk attention by questioning the treatment of Jews when they were struggling to feed their children or protect them from bombs. War exhaustion fostered moral exhaustion. The thought of resisting or even acknowledging atrocity felt overwhelming.
For the Nazi leadership, the war provided more than cover, it provided opportunity. Genocide became easier to justify in the chaos of conflict. Deportations could be framed as security measures. Killings could be hidden behind the language of military necessity. Even within the bureaucracy, documents used euphemisms, special treatment, final measures, evacuation. The war gave a cloak to words that concealed mass death. The final solution, formalized in 1942, unfolded in this environment. As German armies advanced deep into Soviet territory, Einsatzgruppen followed, carrying out mass shootings of Jews. Entire communities were erased in forests and fields. Later, extermination camps carried out killing with industrial efficiency. Yet to Germans at home, these crimes were distant, blurred by the scale of the wider war. When they heard of deportations, they often accepted the story of resettlement. When they heard rumors of killings, they treated them as exaggerated wartime tales. War itself became the excuse not to see. Air raids on German cities deepened the focus on personal survival. By 1943, entire neighborhoods lay in ruins. Families dug through rubble, searched for loved ones, and queued for rations. In this landscape of destruction, empathy narrowed further. Many Germans felt themselves victims of the war, unable or unwilling to recognize the far greater victimization of Jews. Pain at home overshadowed awareness of pain elsewhere. And yet, there were moments when the truth broke through. Smoke from crematoria drifted over nearby towns. The stench of burning bodies was unmistakable. Prisoners from camps worked as forced laborers in German factories, visible to employees who worked beside them. Deportation trains passed through stations where civilians stood on platforms. Each of these moments was a crack in the wall of denial. But war provided the excuse. People told themselves they could do nothing, that such things were necessary in desperate times, that they must focus on their own survival. The war as cover was not only about distraction or censorship, it was about psychology. In war, cruelty becomes expected, even normalized. Violence is everywhere on the battlefield, in the bombed-out streets, in the hunger of children. Against this background, violence of genocide could seem less distinct. When death is everywhere, it is easier not to measure its scale, not to ask its source. By 1944, as defeat loomed, many Germans turned their focus inward even more. The dream of victory faded, replaced by fear of invasion, starvation, and retribution. The persecution of Jews continued, but most Germans concentrated on their own plight. In this narrowing of concern, silence deepened once again. When the camps were finally opened by Allied troops, when the photographs were shown, when the piles of bodies and the ash of crematoria were revealed, many Germans insisted they had not known. But in truth, war had given them a way not to know, to hide knowledge beneath distraction, denial, and fear.
They did not need to know every detail to understand the direction of events. They knew enough. And yet the cover of war allowed them to look away.
The Holocaust unfolded not only because of ideology or hatred, but because the war itself provided perfect conditions for atrocity to hide in plain sight. Under the cover of global conflict, silence became easier, ignorance became safer, denial became plausible. The war was not only the stage for genocide, it was its camouflage.
Part 11. The weight of obedience. Human societies are built on obedience. From childhood, we learn to follow rules, to respect authority, to listen to teachers, parents, leaders. In most cases, this obedience makes life possible, bringing order instead of chaos. But in times of dictatorship, obedience can become a chain that binds conscience, a habit that silences moral resistance. In Nazi Germany, obedience became one of the strongest forces shaping silence and complicity.
The German people had long traditions of discipline and hierarchy. The Prussian military ethos, admired for its efficiency, had celebrated duty above all else. Soldiers were trained to obey without hesitation, to see orders not as suggestions but as commands to be executed.
This culture of obedience extended beyond the army into schools, workplaces, and even families. Respect for authority was deeply ingrained. When the Nazis came to power, they tapped into this tradition, presenting themselves as the ultimate authority, deserving loyalty and trust.
Adolf Hitler positioned himself not as a politician to be questioned, but as the embodiment of the nation. He was the Führer, the leader, whose will was law. Propaganda portrayed him as a figure of destiny, a man chosen by fate to guide Germany to greatness. To obey Hitler was not simply to follow a leader, it was to obey the nation itself, even to obey history.
Disobedience was framed as betrayal not of a man but of Germany.
This framing had profound effects. For soldiers, orders came with the weight of sacred duty. To refuse was to betray comrades, commanders, and country. For bureaucrats, signatures on deportation lists or requisitions for trains were not seen as moral acts but as administrative tasks carried out in the name of loyalty.
For teachers, repeating Nazi ideology was framed as service to the fatherland. In every sphere of life, obedience was redefined as patriotism.
The psychology of obedience is complex. Experiments conducted after the war, most famously by Stanley Milgram in the 1960s, revealed how ordinary people could be led to inflict harm when instructed by authority.
Participants, told to administer electric shocks to others, often continued despite visible distress, not because they were cruel, but because they believed they were fulfilling duty. In Nazi Germany, this same psychology played out on a massive scale. Obedience became the path of least resistance. Consider the role of the civil servant. A clerk in the Ministry of Transport might schedule trains without ever seeing the camps. A policeman might escort Jews onto a train without knowing their final destination. A soldier might guard prisoners without pulling the trigger. Each one saw himself as performing a duty, as obeying orders. Responsibility was diluted through the chain of command, making it easy to say, "I was only doing my job."
This diffusion of responsibility was one of the regime's most effective tools. Orders were given in vague terms, euphemisms disguised intentions, and tasks were divided into small steps. Rarely did an individual see the whole picture. Instead, each carried out a fragment, trusting that the order came from above, believing it was not their place to question.
In such a system, conscience was silenced by hierarchy. The weight of obedience also came from fear of the consequences of disobedience. Soldiers and officials believed that refusal would mean punishment, even death. In reality, evidence suggests that many who resisted orders were not executed but reassigned, yet the belief in severe punishment was enough. Rumors of harsh consequences kept obedience strong, even when disobedience might have been possible. Fear magnified the grip of authority. Social pressure reinforced this obedience. In the army, comradeship was sacred. To disobey was not only to defy superiors, but to betray fellow soldiers. In offices, to question orders was to risk being labeled disloyal. Among neighbors, refusal to conform invited suspicion.
Obedience was not only vertical, directed upward to leaders, but horizontal, reinforced by peers who demanded conformity. The Nazi regime made obedience easier by presenting it as virtuous. Posters, films, and speeches glorified loyalty and discipline. The Hitler Youth drilled children in marching and chanting, teaching them that obedience was honor. Slogans like Ein Volk, Ein Reich, Ein Führer, one people, one empire, one leader, framed obedience as unity. To obey was to belong, to resist was to stand alone. Yet obedience was not blind. Many Germans sensed the moral cost of what they were asked to do. Letters from soldiers describe unease at shootings in the East, shock at the brutality of massacres. Bureaucrats knew that deportations meant suffering, even if they pretended otherwise. Teachers understood that the lessons they taught spread hatred, but obedience gave them a way to silence these doubts. They told themselves they had no choice, that the responsibility was not theirs, that the fault lay higher up the chain. In this way, obedience became not only a habit, but a shield against guilt. The weight of obedience was also shaped by hope. Many Germans believed that if they obeyed, life would improve, the war would be won, Germany would rise. Disobedience, they thought, would only bring disorder and defeat. By framing obedience as the path to victory, the regime made silence seem not only safer but righteous. It is striking to see how ordinary people described themselves after the war. Few claimed to be fanatics. Many described themselves as small wheels in a great machine, powerless to alter its course. They insisted they were simply following orders, fulfilling duties, obeying laws. This self-image reveals how deeply obedience shaped their lives. It allowed them to participate in atrocity while imagining themselves innocent. And yet, obedience was always a choice. There were Germans who refused, who sheltered Jews, who resisted orders, who spoke out despite risk. They were few, but they proved that obedience was not inevitable. Most chose silence because it was easier, safer, more comfortable. The weight of obedience was heavy, but it was not unbreakable. In the end, obedience in Nazi Germany was not simply about discipline. It was about the surrender of responsibility. By obeying without question, people freed themselves from the burden of conscience. They allowed authority to think for them, to decide for them, to bear the moral cost. In this way, obedience became complicity, and silence became participation. The lesson is clear. Obedience, when unexamined, can be as dangerous as hatred. In Nazi Germany, the weight of obedience pressed down on millions, teaching them that silence was duty, that conformity was honor, that loyalty was survival. Under that weight, conscience was crushed and atrocity unfolded. Part 12, Religion and Silence. In times of upheaval, people often turn to faith for guidance, for reassurance, for courage. The churches of Germany, Catholic and Protestant alike, held immense influence in the 1930s and 1940s. Together, they represented tens of millions of believers, families who baptized their children,
who married in their sanctuaries, who turned to priests and pastors for moral direction. In theory, the churches could have been among the strongest voices to oppose Nazism, and yet, when tested, their response was fractured. Some resisted, a few spoke boldly, but most remained silent, or worse, lent their voices to support the regime. To understand why, we must look at the relationship between religion and politics in Germany before Hitler's rise. Protestantism dominated the North, Catholicism the South. For centuries, both traditions had been entwined with state authority, accustomed to working alongside rulers rather than standing against them.
Obedience to God was often linked with obedience to earthly powers. This tradition of deference made it difficult for many church leaders to imagine defiance. When Hitler rose to power, many saw him not as a threat to faith but as a restorer of national strength, even as an instrument of divine will.
In the early years of Nazi rule, some Christians welcomed Hitler enthusiastically. The Protestant German Christians movement aligned itself closely with the regime, seeking to fuse Christianity with Nazi ideology. They adopted swastikas in churches, rewrote hymns to honor Hitler, and preached that God had sent the Führer as a savior for Germany. They sought to purge Christianity of its Jewish roots, downplaying or even rejecting the Old Testament. For them, the message of the gospel was twisted into a message of racial destiny. The Catholic Church, more centralized, was cautious but also compromising. In 1933, the Vatican signed a concordat with the Nazi regime, an agreement meant to protect Catholic institutions in exchange for political neutrality. At first, this seemed pragmatic, a way to preserve schools, charities, and parishes. But in practice, it tied Catholic leaders to silence. While individual priests condemned Nazi abuses, the Church as an institution refrained from open opposition. The Concordat became a shield behind which silence was justified. There were exceptions. Some pastors and priests recognized the danger of Nazism from the beginning. The Confessing Church, formed by Protestant ministers like Martin Niemöller and Dietrich Bonhoeffer, resisted attempts to Nazify Christianity. They declared that Christ, not Hitler, was the true head of the Church. Bonhoeffer in particular spoke with clarity, warning that the Church must not simply bandage the victims under the wheel, but put a spoke in the wheel itself. For this defiance, he was imprisoned and later executed. Niemöller, too, was arrested and spent years in concentration camps. Their courage showed that resistance was possible, but it also revealed how rare it was.
Most clergy, however, chose caution. Sermons avoided politics, focusing instead on personal morality or spiritual comfort. Parishioners who asked about missing neighbors or discriminatory laws often heard vague answers. Silence was framed as prudence, as a way to protect the Church from persecution, as a way to safeguard the faithful.
And yet, in that silence, moral authority was lost. Fear played a role. Priests and pastors who criticized the regime risked arrest, harassment, or worse. Churches that defied Nazi orders were closed. Religious publications were censored. Parents who kept their children from Nazi youth groups sometimes faced retaliation. The price of open defiance was high, and most leaders were unwilling to risk their congregations.
But fear was not the only reason.
Many genuinely shared aspects of Nazi ideology, particularly its nationalism and its anti-Semitism. Centuries of Christian prejudice against Jews made Nazi propaganda easier to accept. Sermons that once condemned Jews for rejecting Christ blended seamlessly with propaganda that condemned them as enemies of the nation. Some church leaders even embraced Hitler's war as a holy cause. Chaplains blessed soldiers, bishops preached of divine destiny, congregations prayed for victory. The language of faith was harnessed to the language of war. Instead of challenging violence, religion was often used to sanctify it. Yet even within this silence, there were flickers of conscience. In 1941, Catholic Bishop Clemens August von Galen delivered sermons condemning the euthanasia program that murdered disabled people. His words stirred outrage, and the program was briefly halted. This showed that when churches spoke boldly, they could still influence public opinion. But such moments were rare. On the central crime of the Holocaust, the persecution and murder of Jews, the churches remained largely mute. Why was this so? Part of the answer lies in the narrow focus of many clergy. They saw their duty as protecting their congregations, their schools, their institutions. They measured success not by speaking truth, but by preserving what they could. Another part lies in the comfort of conformity. Just as ordinary Germans enjoyed rewards for silence, so too did churches enjoy safety by avoiding confrontation. Silence was easier than sacrifice. After the war, many church leaders admitted their failure. They confessed that they had not spoken when they should have, that they had turned away from the suffering of their neighbors. Niemöller, reflecting on his years of silence before his arrest, wrote the famous words, "First they came for the communists, and I did not speak out, because I was not a communist." His words captured the tragedy of silence, the recognition that by failing to defend others, the church had failed itself. The story of religion in Nazi Germany is thus not one of total complicity nor of total resistance. It is a story of division, of compromise, of missed opportunities. A few stood courageously, some embraced the regime, but most remained silent. And in that silence, the moral authority of faith was squandered. The weight of this silence is heavy because the churches could have been powerful voices of opposition. They commanded loyalty from millions. They shaped consciences. They offered moral frameworks. Had they spoken clearly, loudly, and unitedly, they might have disrupted the complacency that allowed persecution to grow. Instead, their silence became another layer of consent, another strand in the web of complicity. For ordinary believers, the silence of their leaders made the bystanders' choice easier. If priests and pastors did not speak, if bishops and bishops' conferences said little, then parishioners could tell themselves that silence was acceptable. Faith meant to comfort the afflicted, too often comforted the indifferent. Part 13, Small Acts, Large Consequences. History often remembers the sweeping events, the speeches of leaders, the signing of laws, the battles fought on distant fields. But the life of a dictatorship is also made up of the smallest decisions, the quiet choices of ordinary people. A nod, a word, a gesture, a silence. These too shape the path of nations. In Nazi Germany, small acts, whether of resistance or of acceptance, carried consequences far beyond what individuals imagined. Consider first the small acts of acceptance. They were everywhere, woven into the fabric of daily life. A shopkeeper who displayed a "Jews not welcome" sign on his door, A teacher who replaced old textbooks with Nazi-approved versions. A family who hung the swastika flag outside their home on holidays. These acts might have seemed minor, matters of routine or self-protection. Yet together they created an atmosphere in which persecution felt normal. Every flag in a window told neighbors that conformity was expected. Every shop sign reminded Jews that exclusion was sanctioned. Every textbook spread propaganda to the next generation. Silence itself was one of the most powerful small acts. A person who looked away as a neighbor was evicted, who said nothing when coworkers joked about Jews, who kept quiet when rumors of killings spread. Such silence may have felt passive, but it carried weight. Silence signaled acceptance. It told the regime that people would not resist. It told victims that they were alone. The absence of protest was itself a form of complicity, strengthening the system by leaving it unchallenged. There were also acts of denunciation, seemingly small, but devastating in consequence. A neighbor who reported a careless remark to the Gestapo, a coworker who whispered that someone listened to foreign radio broadcasts, a student who told teachers that his parents criticized the regime. Many denunciations were motivated not by ideology, but by jealousy, rivalry, or personal gain, yet each one could destroy a life. Small words spoken in malice could lead to arrest, imprisonment, even death. And yet the story is not only of acceptance, there were also small acts of resistance. A farmer who hid food for a Jewish neighbor, a railway worker who left a water bucket near a deportation train, a priest who spoke a word of comfort to a condemned prisoner, a child who smuggled notes into a ghetto. These acts rarely changed the course of the war, but for those who received them, they meant everything. They were reminders of humanity in a world of cruelty. Some small acts grew into larger forms of resistance. The White Rose movement, led by students like Hans and Sophie Sohl, began with pamphlets, words printed on paper, calling Germans to resist. The pamphlets were few, scattered across university halls and mailed anonymously, but their message spread. "We will not be silent," they wrote. For these words, the students were arrested and executed. Their acts were small in scale, yet their courage echoed far beyond their time. Similarly, individual families risked everything to shelter Jews. The cost of such an act was enormous. Discovery meant arrest or execution. Yet some chose to take that risk, motivated by conscience, by faith, by friendship. These families often saw their acts not as heroic, but as necessary, as simply doing what was right. Their small acts of defiance stood as beacons in a sea of silence. It is important to recognize, however, that such resistance was rare. The majority chose compliance, whether through fear, self-interest, or indifference. And this compliance was not dramatic. It was found in the small acts of everyday life, in the greetings exchanged, the flags displayed, the silences maintained. These acts accumulated, creating a society where persecution was not only allowed, but sustained by ordinary choices.
This raises an uncomfortable truth. Dictatorships do not function solely through the commands of leaders or the brutality of police. They function because millions of small acts, performed by ordinary people, align to give them strength. Every signature on a document, every salute in a street, every silence in a conversation adds weight to the system. No single act builds the machinery of oppression, but together they keep it running. After the war, many Germans insisted that their actions had been too small to matter. They claimed they were powerless, that their choices were insignificant in the face of a vast regime, and yet history shows the opposite. Small acts mattered immensely. A denunciation could end a life, a silence could permit a crime,
A whispered word of comfort could sustain hope. In times of moral crisis, there is no neutrality in the small things. Each act, however quiet, tilts the balance. The tragedy of Nazi Germany is that so many small acts lean toward compliance. It was easier to hang a flag than to refuse, easier to remain silent than to protest, easier to report a neighbor than to protect one, easier to believe official lies than to confront disturbing truths. These choices may have seemed minor, but collectively they created the silence in which genocide unfolded. And yet, even the smallest acts of resistance remind us that alternatives existed. Not everyone complied. Not everyone was silent. Some chose differently, even at great risk. Their courage was exceptional, but it proves that conformity was not inevitable. In the weight of history, the difference between silence and speech, between looking away and reaching out, between compliance and defiance, is vast. In the end, the story of small acts in Nazi Germany is the story of how ordinary life becomes extraordinary in times of moral crisis. Choices that seemed trivial, a word, a gesture, a silence, became loaded with consequence. The regime depended on millions of such choices to function. And in the accumulation of these small acts, the fate of millions was sealed. A lesson lingers. In the face of injustice, there are no neutral acts. What seems small may, in the long view, carry enormous weight. Part 14, After the Ashes. In May 1945, Germany lay in ruins. The cities were shattered, bridges collapsed, factories silent, and millions of families displaced. Air raids had left neighborhoods reduced to rubble. Food was scarce, fuel gone, homes destroyed. The once proud Reich, promised 1,000 years, had lasted barely 12. In the wreckage, the silence that had sustained the regime was broken, not by choice, but by defeat. And into that silence poured the truths that so many had avoided for years. The Allied armies advanced from every direction. American, British, and Soviet soldiers moved through towns and villages that had once echoed with Nazi parades. With them came the opening of the camps. At Buchenwald, Dachau, Bergen-Belsen, Auschwitz, and dozens more, the world saw what had been hidden behind barbed wire: emaciated prisoners, piles of bodies, ashes from crematoria, warehouses filled with shoes, glasses, and children's toys. These images shocked the world. They also shocked the German people, many of whom were forced to confront what they had chosen not to see. In towns near camps, Allied commanders ordered civilians to tour the sites. Men, women, and children walked past mass graves, piles of corpses, and skeletal survivors. Photographs show villagers covering their mouths in horror, some fainting, some staring blankly. Many insisted they had not known. They swore they were seeing these things for the first time. But the Allies did not accept these claims. This, they said, was on your doorstep. The smell of burning flesh, the sight of deportations, the rumors of killings, these had been present for years. Ignorance was not innocence. Still, denial became widespread. Germans claimed that the regime had misled them, that they had been deceived by propaganda. Some insisted they had believed deportations were resettlements, that camps were labor colonies. Others argued that they had been too concerned with their own survival to notice. For many, denial was a shield against guilt. To admit knowledge was to admit complicity. To admit complicity was to face unbearable shame. And yet, beneath denial, fragments of truth emerged. Soldiers wrote in diaries of mass shootings. Railway workers recalled the trains. Neighbors admitted seeing Jews marched away. Survivors told stories of betrayal by friends, colleagues, even fellow churchgoers. The evidence of awareness could not be erased. The silence of the past now echoed as accusation. The Allies sought accountability. The Nuremberg trials prosecuted leaders of the regime, exposing documents, films, and testimony that laid bare the machinery of genocide. For the German public, these trials were both shocking and uncomfortable. They revealed the planning, the euphemisms, the bureaucratic precision of mass murder. They revealed that what many had dismissed as rumor was in fact true, and far worse than imagined. Still, many Germans distanced themselves. They insisted that guilt belonged to the leaders, the SS, the party, but not to the ordinary citizen. We did not know, they repeated. We could not have known. This insistence was part self-deception, part survival. In the ruins of war, Germans faced hunger, homelessness, and fear of occupation. To carry the additional weight of moral guilt was more than most could bear. They focused instead on rebuilding, on caring for families, on survival once more. Confronting complicity was postponed, avoided, deferred. Silence continued, but now it was silence about guilt. There were, however, voices that refused to let silence reign. Survivors spoke, sometimes through memoirs, sometimes in court, sometimes to neighbors who would listen. They told of betrayals, of deportations, of life in ghettos and camps. Their testimony was met at times with disbelief, at times with indifference. The horror was so vast that many could not or would not grasp it fully. But slowly these voices began to shape memory. In the churches, too, reflection began. Pastors and priests confessed their failures, acknowledging that they had not spoken when they should have. Martin Niemöller's famous words, "First they came for the communists, and I did not speak out," captured the tragedy of silence. They became a symbol of how complacency and cowardice had allowed atrocity to spread. For younger generations born during the war or just after, the confrontation with guilt became sharper. In the 1960s and 1970s, as survivors shared their stories and historians documented the crimes, young Germans began to ask their parents, "What did you do? What did you know?" These questions pierced the silence, forcing families to reckon with truths long buried. The answers were often evasive, but the questions themselves kept memory alive. The ruins of Germany were not only physical, but moral. Rebuilding required more than bricks and mortar. It required facing the ashes of conscience, the recognition that silence had been a choice with terrible consequences. For many, this reckoning was slow, uneven, incomplete, but it could not be entirely avoided. The story of After the Ashes is thus a story of confrontation and denial, of horror revealed and guilt evaded. Some Germans acknowledged complicity and sought forgiveness. Others clung to ignorance as protection. Most lived in the uneasy space between, aware of fragments of truth, but unwilling to face the whole. What is clear is that the claim of total ignorance cannot stand. The persecution of Jews was public, visible, undeniable. The Holocaust may have been hidden in its full scale, but its outlines were known. The silence of Germans before 1945 was not ignorance alone, but a mixture of fear, indifference, and willful blindness. After 1945, the silence that followed was shaped by shame, denial, and the struggle to rebuild. Standing in the ruins of 1945, one sees the consequences of silence stretched across 2 decades. The silence that began with small exclusions that deepened through fear and conformity that endured through war and denial. This silence ended in ash, both literal and moral. The lesson is harsh but necessary. Silence is not empty. It carries weight, and after the ashes, the weight of silence became clear. Part 15, The Lesson of Silence. When we reach the end of this story, the ruins of war and genocide lie before us. The questions remain: how could it have happened? How could millions of ordinary people, most of them neither fanatics nor sadists, have allowed such cruelty to unfold in their midst? The answers are many, but at their core is silence. Silence born of fear, of selfishness, of habit, of obedience, of denial. Silence that began with small concessions and ended in catastrophe. The lesson of silence is not simple, because silence itself is not simple. It can be passive or deliberate, fearful or comfortable, protective or selfish. In Nazi Germany, silence was a shield for some, a weapon for others, and a choice for most. It is this complexity that makes the story so unsettling, because silence is something familiar to all of us. We have seen how silence began with humiliation after the First World War, when people longed for order more than freedom. We have seen how the allure of a strong hand made obedience feel like safety. We have seen how propaganda, discipline, and ritual created an atmosphere where questioning felt unnatural. We have seen how enemies were defined, neighbors turned into outsiders, and silence became the easiest response. We have seen how small acts of compliance, a salute, a flag, a word unspoken, accumulated until resistance seemed impossible. We have also seen that silence was not only enforced by violence. It was bought with rewards, jobs gained, homes acquired, businesses taken. It was reinforced by fear of denunciation, by the Gestapo's shadow, by the uncertainty of who could be trusted. It was deepened by war, when survival narrowed the horizon of concern and cruelty was hidden beneath the noise of global conflict. And when the war ended, silence returned again, this time as denial, as refusal to admit what had been known, as a way of surviving the shame of complicity. The lesson of silence, then, is that atrocity does not depend only on the hatred of the few. It depends on the quiet of the many. Without silence, persecution meets resistance. Without silence, lies meet contradiction. Without silence, cruelty is harder to hide.
The Holocaust was possible not only because leaders ordered it, but because millions allowed it, each silence building on the last until silence itself became the language of a nation.
And yet, within this silence, there were exceptions. A farmer who hid a family, a student who wrote a leaflet, a pastor who spoke from the pulpit despite risk. These acts remind us that silence is not destiny. Choices existed, and some chose differently. Their courage was rare, but it proves that complicity was not inevitable. The lesson of their voices is as important as the lesson of silence. Even small acts of defiance matter. What makes this lesson enduring is not only its history, but its relevance. Silence is not confined to Germany in the 1930s and 1940s. It is a human tendency that appears whenever injustice rises. To remain quiet, to look away, to protect oneself at the expense of others, these choices are always near at hand. They are tempting because they are easy, because they feel safe, because they spare us discomfort. The story of Nazi Germany shows us what happens when too many choose that path. The lesson of silence is not meant to condemn alone, but to warn. It teaches us to listen for the moments when silence begins to grow, when small exclusions are accepted, when propaganda dulls our empathy, when obedience erodes conscience. It reminds us that injustice often arrives step by step, disguised as normal, wrapped in the language of necessity. If we wait for catastrophe before breaking silence, it may already be too late. This lesson also teaches us humility. It is easy, looking back, to imagine that we would have resisted, that we would have spoken out, that we would have refused compliance. But the truth is more difficult. Most people did not. They told themselves they were powerless, or that silence was safer, or that they knew less than they did. To imagine ourselves immune to these temptations is to miss the true warning of history. Silence is ordinary. It is the path most people take when confronted with danger or moral challenge. The extraordinary act is to break it. That is why the voices of the few, the Bonhoeffers, the Scholls, the anonymous rescuers echo so loudly across time. They remind us of the possibility and the cost of choosing differently. As we close this story, we stand among its lessons. The Holocaust was not inevitable. It was the result of choices, large and small, repeated across years. It grew in the soil of despair. It thrived in the atmosphere of propaganda. It advanced through fear and obedience. It was sustained by silence. And when the ashes settled, silence lingered still. To remember this is not only to honor the victims, but to guard against repetition. The lesson of silence calls us to awareness, to vigilance, to the courage of speech. It tells us that complacency is dangerous, that complicity often comes not from malice, but from quiet, and that justice requires more than empathy, it requires voice. The people of Germany in the 1930s and 1940s were not unique in their capacity for silence. They were human, and it is this very humanity that makes the lesson urgent. For if silence allowed such horrors once, silence could allow them again. The ashes of history whisper a warning. Silence is never neutral. It is always a choice, and its consequences, however small they seem, may shape the fate of millions. And so we reach the end of this journey. The story we have walked through together is heavy yet necessary. It reminds us how silence, step by step, can become complicity, and how the choices of ordinary people shape the fate of nations. Thank you for staying with me through this long reflection. By remembering, we honor those who suffered, and we keep their memory alive. If you found this story meaningful, please take a moment to press the like button. If you're new here, consider subscribing so you can join us for more gentle explorations of history told in this calm and reflective way. And I would love it if you left a comment sharing your thoughts or simply where you were listening from tonight. Your support helps this channel grow, and it lets me continue bringing you these long-form stories to relax, reflect, and remember. For now, let yourself rest. Close your eyes if you wish. Let the echoes of history fade into quiet. And may peace be with you.